Hi, my name is Mark Graham and I'm going to talk about POCA, the proceeds of crime, in this series of videos. Why am I an expert on that? Well, because for 13 years I was Britain's biggest grower of cannabis and I felt the full force of POCA eventually. I'm not going to talk about the pros and cons of cannabis, whether it's safe, whether it's not safe. That's the information on that subject is all over the internet. All I will say is that for the 13 years that I grew cannabis, demand was insatiable. The great British public just couldn't get enough of it. So what is POCA, the proceeds of crime? Well, the government describes it as returning the ill-gotten gains of drug dealing to the community. Naturally, this isn't the case. The Proceeds of Crime Act is about the government taking as much money as possible from people who have been selling drugs and splitting it 50-50 with the police. POCA is a scam. It is a law that was brought in by the Blair government to cut the government in on the profits of illegal drug crime. It's against the law to tax activities that are illegal, so the government simply found a way round that. Let me explain how POCA works. The next thing is the CPS starts concocting an impossibly large estimate of the amount of money the person could possibly have made from their drug dealing. It doesn't matter whether the estimate is accurate or not, the only thing that matters is inference. If the CPS can invent a line of argument that sounds half plausible, the POCA judge will most certainly go along with it. Why would he do that? Well, because the judge is the representative of the government in this court. He's hardly going to side with the defendant. So why does all this matter? Well, POCA turns the presumption of innocence on its head. POCA assumes guilt, and that opens the way for inference in preference to hard evidence. This bad law is corrupting the entire legal system. It's certainly corrupting the police, and I'll go on to talk about that in the next video. If you're interested in reading more, you might care to look at my ebook on Amazon, Cannabis Man. It's my story of how I successfully grew cannabis for 13 years and my entanglement then with the forces of so-called law and order. So the idea now is for the CPS to inflate the bill to an impossibly large amount, an amount that the defendant can't possibly pay. And that puts him in a situation where the debt then extends beyond the determination of this court and into the rest of his life. So now let's say a young man is stopped and he's got a quantity of cannabis in his car. The first thing the police will want to do is to try and make the accusation stick that he's a dealer and that it's not for personal consumption. Let's say there's £500 worth of cannabis in the glove compartment. Well, the next thing that the CPS will do, they will inflate this figure because they will say, well, if you sold it in very small quantities, it's probably worth nearer £1,000 than £500. And what's more, because we're going to accuse you of being a dealer, the fact that we've found this cannabis on you is simply the remnants of the stuff you've been selling. You probably had a lot more yesterday, and there are 5 days in a week, and there are 52 weeks in a year, so pretty soon this £500 worth of cannabis can be made to sound like a £100,000 a year drug dealing operation. And that of course is exactly what the CPS wants, because all they have to do is go into court with this made up inference and put it before a judge, and the judge is going to say, whoopee, there's another £100,000 we can put in the kitty. It's all a fiction, of course. I'm a little concerned that you might think I'm exaggerating all of this, so let me quote from Blackstone's Proceeds of Crime, a book written by Edward Rees QC, he's a barrister, and 2 other eminent legal minds. I'll just quote from something on page 18 first of all. The scheme of the Act is meant to be severe and unforgiving. Anyone with legal training coming fresh to confiscation law may feel disoriented. Part 2 appears to occupy some parallel legal universe which has no apparent relationship with the normal rules of criminal process. It goes on. evidential burdens are cast upon the defendant which are, to say the least, unusual in the area of criminal law. That's a quote from a judge. This is an extraordinary law that goes against all the expectations and all the rules and all the provisions of 500 years of English law. Page 48. An enthusiastic court, meaning a judge, an enthusiastic court can make sweeping and expensive findings which have no tangible foundation in evidence. Say no more. They make it up as they go along. So let me just carry on with this hypothetical example. This young man stopped in his car, some cannabis found in the glove compartment. The police will make a judgment to the effect that it's more than for personal consumption, so they'll hand the case over to the CPS. They then take the next steps in exaggeration. They will say, right, well, it's not for personal consumption, therefore you were a dealer. The amount that we found are the remnants of your dealings. You've obviously been dealing for some time. They will look into his affairs, they will check his daytime job, and they'll see how much money he earns, and they'll look at his flat that is probably heavily mortgaged and his nice car. The police obsess on cars. They'll check to see if he's been on holiday, they'll check his bank account, and they will arrange to come to the conclusion that the man's lifestyle is in excess of what he could afford from a regular job. So then the inferences and the exaggerations begin, and they will come up with a figure that they present to the court that is far greater than by any imagination can be considered what really has happened in the last year. The judge, an enthusiastic court as they say, a judge will rubber stamp the allegations, and this young guy will be presented with a bill that he can't possibly pay, even when they take his flat and take the equity out of it, and they've already taken his car. I spoke to someone in prison, and the police had taken all his clothes. The only thing they left him with were the clothes he was standing up in and some underwear and socks in a drawer. They do take everything. So then we draw a line under this case. The young lad does prison time. He's had all his money taken off him. Eventually he comes out of prison and he settles down and he gets a decent job again, and eventually he meets a girl and they get married and they have a child, and the years go by, and the CPS decides they now have some equity in their house. So the CPS come along, the government comes along, and they force the sale of the house because he still has a whopping great debt hanging over him. The equity in the house will be divided in two, and the part that's his will be taken. His wife or his partner, meanwhile, will probably take the view that there's no future in staying with this man, because every time they amass any kind of assets that will allow them a decent future, the government will simply come along and take it, so she probably decides to leave him. So my point is this: is this system more likely or less likely to ensure that this young man reverts to criminality rather than tries to stay on the path of the straight and narrow? And I would argue that this law actually is designed in part to ensure that criminality goes on year after year. People who are found to be criminals are put in a position where they have no choice other than to stay as criminals, and this of course suits the massive juggernaut that is the law and order justice system. It continues to pay the salaries, the pensions, the fast cars, and all the perks that go with it. So I've talked about hypothetically how the Proceeds of Crime Act really works. In the next video, which I'm going to produce just as soon as I can, I'm going to show you how it actually worked in my case. Notably, one of my lawyers, my second lawyer, I fired the first lawyer because he was working for the prosecution. My second lawyer said, the things that happened on the Welsh circuit would make your hair stand on end, and I think that's certainly true. So stay tuned.